Hello, welcome to Pull or Pass After Dark. I'm Zach, and this past week I spoke with writer Dan Watters about his series Coffin Bound, some of the other titles he's worked on, and just a bit of comics in general, really. The first volume of Coffin Bound, Happy Ashes, is available now through Image Comics. As we'll say in the podcast, I'm not sure about UK release, but it's definitely available in the US and digitally. In the last couple of years, he's also been working on Lucifer as part of the Sandman universe line over at DC Comics. And aside from that, in the past, he's worked on books like Limbo, also at Image, Deep Roots for Vault as part of the White Noise Collective, and Tortured Life, which was released through T Publishing once upon a time. Now, I will say this, we did have some technical issues with this episode, so if it does sound like we've had to chat beforehand, it's because we have. So let's dive in. Hi, Dan Watters. Thank you for joining me, and how are you?
I'm good. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, it's really great to talk to you again. So just to start off, what was it that got you into comic books, both as a creator and a fan?
I think it's a similar story to a lot of people in that I liked them when I was a kid, particularly in that sort of British way. We have comics like Beano and Dandy and all that kind of stuff, and I used to get those every week, and then progressed onto the Marvel stuff, and then sort of lost interest as I found other things, puberty inspired other things. And then came back to it as a sort of slightly older teenager when I discovered the huge graphic novel section at the local library, including they had a lot of Sandman, they had a lot of like Mike Carey's Lucifer, all that kind of stuff. And I sort of devoured a lot of that, and it's kind of stayed with me since then.
Yeah, it's a lot of classic 90s Vertigo titles, I think, inspired a lot of people.
They had a lot of that, and they had a lot of weird stuff as well. I'm trying to remember like the kind of stuff they had, but it was sort of some really oddball sort of like 2000 AD collections and things like that, which stuff and graphic memoirs and things like sort of Mouse was in there. And
okay, that's an interesting combination of odd titles.
I was sort of devouring everything by medium rather than by genre.
Yeah. I had a very similar thing with our school library. For some reason, had like V for Vendetta and Watchmen, and then stuff like, just 2000 AD, but just the really grim bits of Judge Dredd. And it was always like, why is this what you've chosen for us? But yeah,
I love that side of school libraries. Like, I always loved that sort of thing where you go to the school library and I don't really remember them having comics. I don't think they did. It was a Catholic school, so there was no fun allowed.
Of course.
But we had they'd have sort of like sci-fi collections, or they'd have sort of horror-ish sort of mystery collections. Yeah. And then you'd sort of pick these things up, and they'd have like Ray Bradbury stories, or they'd have Vonnegut stories, or they'd have some really sort of grimmer stuff, and you sort of read it and you go like, oh, I don't think they know this is in here. I think this is sort of snuck by, in a way that comics doesn't get away with as much, because like the visuals are immediately apparent. But I always like that element of there being sort of stuff that shouldn't be there in the school library.
Yeah, I imagine it's probably something that is quite common, and it's just, I suppose, when you're the teenager, you think, I wonder if everyone's school's like this. But yeah, it's a weird one. Yeah, I don't know how the comics got by in ours when it's, Judge Death and V for Vendetta and things that are like, this is not for kids, but okay.
Maybe you had an anarchist librarian.
I wish that was true. That would be so much more interesting. So this past week, your newest trade paperback, Coffin Bound, was released, at least in the US and digitally. I'm still not sure what the situation is here in the UK.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to wait a little bit longer for it, unfortunately. I think they're sat in a warehouse somewhere.
Yeah, it does kind of sound that way. At least it is available online digitally, and there are options there. But I'd quite like to dig into Coffin Bound and talk about, the different influences and all things Coffin Bound, if that's okay with you. I'm
Yeah,
sure
absolutely.
it is.
Yeah, so it's volume 1 that's just come out. The first 4 issues that we made since, I think, first issue came out in August, and we waited a little bit longer to bring the trade out because we've got the second arc coming in the summer, or in theory coming in the summer.
Yeah, of course.
So we wanted to have those a little bit closer together.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's good to give people that chance to catch up. So just for people at home who may not know, could you give us a bit of a loose intro to Coffin Bound?
Coffin Bound. I mean, it's we sort of pitched it as this grindhouse thriller, kind of supernatural grindhouse thriller thing, but it's essentially about a woman called Izzy Tyburn who finds out she has this unstoppable hitman put on her tail called the Earth Eater, who follows his victims by swallowing mud and using it to track their sort of routes. And because he's entirely unstoppable, she decides that instead of trying to escape this fate, she's going to ease her passing and show her disdain for the world by removing from it every trace that she's left. So she's road tripping back through her own life, through everywhere she's been and seeing everyone she's known and trying to destroy as much evidence of her existence as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good in-depth description, really, yeah. It's a really interesting, quite surreal 4 issues. And one of the things that I got thinking about was there's a lot of antagonists in this first volume, and all coming from kind of different angles, but similar angles, if that makes sense. Which the more I thought about it, the more I was kind of interested in the Earth Eater and Polly and just everything that's going on all at once. What was it that made you decide to go kind of so heavy on the, I want to say villains, but villains seems an extreme word for some of them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think of Earth Eater so much as a villain. He's a force. Yeah, he's probably not a very subtle metaphor as things go. It's a book about death, and he's the unstoppable hitman that's on her tail. Yeah. And he's kind of you can't bargain with him, you can't reason with him. He is coming, and he's not necessarily in a rush. But when he catches up to you, that's it. It's done. So he's definitely like a force of nature in that way. Whereas Paulie's just a horrible bastard.
Yeah, fair.
And, he's a poet, so of course he's a horrible bastard.
I really felt with Paulie that he does have kind of a Neil Gaiman Sandman villain kind of vibe to him, That kind of... I don't know how I want to describe this. The kind of villain that you kind of get what they're about, but also completely don't get what they're about at the same time, Yeah,
I'm not sure he quite gets what he's about.
It does sound like a lot of creative people I know, to be fair.
Yeah, he's a strange guy with sort of delusions of grandeur and a nasty streak. And unfortunately, he's found himself in a position of some power and control over people. He's just a pretty toxic guy, I think is the core of it, with too much power. Yeah,
I think that's a fair description. So one of the things that interested me with Coffin Bound in general is there are a lot of just a lot of different supernatural elements all coming together in a kind of patchwork way, I suppose. What was it that inspired the kind of merging of different supernatural ideas?
Yeah, it is. I know we've kind of set ourselves up for a bit of a for it, but what you sort of said before, it's quite a surreal book, and I didn't realize it was until people started saying that.
Okay.
Which I maybe sounds a little bit pretentious, but I was actually trying to veer away from things being actively surreal in any real way, in that there's never, if you sort of look at actual surrealist sort of cinema and stuff, like, just go back to like Un Chien Andalou, which I'm mangling the name of, but Dali's film. There's never any in Coffin Bound. There's never anything which happens without cause and effect. Everything in Coffin Bound's about cause and effect.
Okay.
And the kind of thing, like Danny and I wanted to put everything we wanted to put in the book. We were kind of making an active effort not to limit ourselves without sort of just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what stuck. We wanted everything to work together, including the supernatural elements. There's sort of light sci-fi elements and things. And as I kind of figured, as long as everything has cause and effect, as long as everything makes sense and one thing leads to another and the actions always have consequences, then it would kind of gel together. And I think it does. But it does make it hard. Like, you know, when they first sent me the solicit information, they said, what genre is this book? It was like, sort of horror, sci-fi, adventure, crime, supernatural, magic. I don't know. It's everything that made sense at the time, I suppose.
I hope that's the genre that's listed on the back of the book as well. I hope. Just an endless list.
I think it's horror, crime, fantasy, which I suppose is as close as you can get. The fantasy is a funny one, isn't it, as a genre description? Because it, or at least for me, it sort of conjures very different images to what it actually encompasses.
Yeah, I agree. I frequently had the conversation about the fine line that we often have between like sci-fi and fantasy, and that sometimes it's pretty close, and fantasy and horror is also pretty close. It's just... Yeah.
I mean, I also find it funny the stuff that gets doesn't get called sci-fi or fantasy or stuff, because there's so much sort of quote-unquote literary fiction, which is very much science fiction in particular. I mean, you know, you can sort of talk about Salman Rushdie's work as being sort of fantasy, and then, you know, you get into that whole like magic realism versus fantasy thing, where sometimes magic realism just sounds like it's fantasy, but we don't want to call it that because it hasn't got dragons in. But you also get the sort of the sci-fi side of stuff like Infinite Jest, which is, I think, set in 2004, written in 95, 96 and set in 2004. And it has this videotape which is killing people, and it has, although it's not a videotape, it's basically a DVD, and, you know, it had predicted DVDs and all this kind of stuff, but no one ever talks about it as a sci-fi novel.
Yeah.
And the other one that always comes to my mind is Samuel Beckett's Endgame, which is absolutely a post-apocalyptic play, but you would never call it that because it's too prestigious.
It is an interesting one. Genre is super weird at times. It's both a blessing and a curse, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not anti it. As I think we talked about this a bit before, but the sort of genre descriptors become more useful as they become more nebulous.
Yes, that's true.
You know, if you're talking about something as sort of high fantasy and things like that, then it's like, okay, now you're starting to give me a broader idea of what it actually is.
Yeah, the different category, the more categories we get in genre, the more useful they become, I think.
Yeah, as long as we don't let them define what we make, that's the only problem.
Yeah, that's true. An interesting thought, actually. Yeah, I think a lot of people work into a genre rather than working and then seeing where they end up.
Yeah, I think it's a pitfall that that can definitely be there, or wanting to work in a tone without having a story first.
Yeah. Always have an idea before you have a tone. While we are talking about genre, I do feel like there's certain horror vibes throughout most of your work, if not all of it at the moment. What is it in particular that led to you deciding to work so much with kind of horror concepts?
I wasn't allowed any as a kid, which sounds flippant. Now. I think it's a lot of the truth. My parents were never overbearing or anything like that, but my mum had been really bothered by horror stuff when she was young.
Okay, yeah.
And she'd been sort of traumatized by Blue Velvet and things like this, and so she paid quite strict attention to sort of like the age ratings on films and things like that. And we had this video store down the bottom of our road, back when that was a thing, video rental store. And they used to keep all the, they had all the video cases. They'd take out the slip cases and they'd put them into these folders, into these binders. Mm-hmm. And that's what you went through to pick your films, rather than having the cases all up on the walls. Okay. And they had those divided up by genre. So every time I go in there, and I was probably, from the age of sort of 6 to the age of 12, I was sort of going in there and picking up the horror binder in particular, and just going through it and looking at all these covers for films that I was absolutely I had no way of getting hold of, no way of seeing, and just imagining that these are the imagination from these covers and the blurbs used to sort of, the thrill I got from that was just, I think very formative. It was, and the things that I imagined these films were was obviously 1,000 times worse than the actual films for the most part. I thought Child's Play was going to be the most terrifying thing.
And for a few years it is.
It is, but I don't think I anticipate the amount of slapstick in it.
Yeah, it's an unpredictable one.
One film they had in there, which used to scare the bejesus out of me as a concept, was the film The Dentist.
Okay.
Starring Jeffrey Combs. And Jeffrey Combs is a delight in absolutely anything he's in, but I didn't know who that was back then, and the idea of this film absolutely terrified me. But it's a ridiculous, schlocky joy of just watching Jeffrey Combs go mad over 2 hours, or an hour and a half, I guess, because it was an 80s film. But yeah. I think so. Long story long. I wasn't exposed to a lot of horror when I was younger, and then when I was sort of old enough to seek it out for myself, whether through subterfuge or not, I just immediately gravitated towards it, really, really hard. And ever since then, I've kind of never lost that love for all things horror. Really, I love everything from the sort of the super schlocky, the 1920s Dracula, and all the way up to the really gruesome stuff. The torture porn I could probably take or leave, to be honest. It doesn't tend to have much of a point.
Yeah.
But up to a certain extent, yeah, I love films like sort of Audition and Martyrs. I thought had set certain merits, even though it was a bit much.
Okay, that's a pretty good explanation for why so horror.
I think thinking about that, I always had the goosebumps though. That was from like the age of 6. I think the first thing that really traumatized me was a Goosebumps book.
Yeah, I can understand. I think between the TV series and the Goosebumps books, I think they got everyone at some point,
Yeah. I mean, Are You Afraid of the Dark always seemed to have more edge as a TV show, but they were both good.
Yeah.
There was one Goosebumps book where they went to a tower and they put on I'd never heard of thumb screws before.
Right. Okay.
And they start using thumb screws on people and stuff. It was quite intense for a 7 or 8 year old.
Yeah, that suddenly seems quite gruesome when you look back on it. I guess that's the thing. I think I haven't looked back at a lot of the Goosebumps stuff, but I'm sure even now I'd be uncomfortable with some of it. I'm still worried garden gnomes are going to eat me, which is just that's a fear for life now, I think. So one of the questions I wanted to ask, kind of coming off the back of the horror question, is do you think at some point you will work in other less horror genres? Are we going to see a romantic comedy or?
I'd love to do a romantic comedy actually. I mean, yeah. I think it's there as an underlying. I've done things that aren't horror in a significant way, but it does seem to creep into the sort of undercurrent of what I'm doing. I mean, I did an Ocean Master special.
Yeah.
towards the end of last year, which did sort of turn into Midian. There was sort of when I was getting the art back in, I was like, there's a bit where Ocean Master feeds a supervillain to his new army of underwater monsters, and I was like, oh, I've done the same thing again, haven't I? But yeah, I don't want that to limit me in any sort of way. The stuff I'm looking at doing soon, soon hopefully stuff starts picking back up again and printers start working again and all that kind of stuff. I would like to do some stuff which is just a little bit more realism, a little bit more Will Eisner.
Okay. That's interesting. I look forward to seeing which directions you go in.
I just never want anything to be too much of a crutch. I think anytime you get too comfortable, you should probably move on.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's and don't get me wrong, I like all the horror. All the horror is good. It's just
me too.
curiosity of what's to come, really. One thing as well that I think does tie in with with all the titles you work with is I think you've always worked with really different but really amazing artists. I think Casper Wingard and Danny. And how have you found working with different? Because have you had a different artist for every project you worked on so far? I think.
I mean, yes-ish, but projects, at different lengths.
True.
I've been working with the Fumara brothers on Lucifer for
of course,
2 years now. So yes, we've been working on one project, but it's been for a good long time. Casper and I are working on a new book together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been really cool. I think that probably has been the first time that I've really circled back with someone. But Casper and I, we did our first book together. Limbo was our first book.
Yeah.
So to circle back around and see where we're at now, sort of a couple of years later, has been really cool. And we've always, we've never not wanted to work together. It's just been that work and life has sort of pulled us to do different things.
Of course,
he ended up at Marvel doing a lot of stuff, and I ended up at DC. So it's not been opportune until now. Sort of to start working on something again. Danny and I are working together now. Again, we're working on the second book of Coffin Bound.
Oh, of course, yeah.
But yeah, they were all really good artists. I've gotten very lucky. I got very lucky with the. I mean, I say lucky. I don't mean to sort of disparage my own work, but falling in with someone like Casper and realizing that we really gelled and had similar ideas for what we wanted to do back when we were starting Limbo.
Mm-hmm.
It could have taken me longer. It could have been harder for me to get a foothold, I think, without that having happened.
So while we talk about Limbo, actually, so it's been 5 years now since the first issue of Limbo, or at least nearly 5 years, I think.
Jesus.
So how do you feel that you've kind of developed as a creator in those 5 years? It's been Limbo was your first Image book, and now you've gone back to Image for Coffin Bound. So how do you think you've changed as a creator and developed and whatnot? Words like that.
Well, I think you're always kind of developing as a creator. I'm far more interested in story structures and how stories work now, whereas with Limbo it was a little bit more gung-ho, a little bit more seat of the pants with the sort of rough outline, but just letting it sort of wind its way wherever it wanted to go. Which was okay to do on that book, I think, because it was structured around the idea of the detective novel and things, so that structure was always there to sort of pull us back. Yeah. But I think if I'd done that with something like Coffin Bound, it could have ended up kind of nonsensical. Other than that, I think trying to expunge a lot of comic book influences from my writing. So not trying to write like Morrison or Gaiman or Ellis or any of the people that really sort of blew my mind when I grew up, or when I sort of started writing, and trying to look further afield for influences and trying to work out what my voice is more than any kind of mimicry, which I think is a pretty common thing when you start out. You have to sort of find your voice by mimicking other people's.
Yeah, I think that's very true in all kind of creative aspects. I think
it's what we do as infants anyway, isn't it? It's literally how we learn to. It's how we learn how to speak. So it's how we learn how to find a voice as well.
Yeah, that's very true. And it is interesting because I do like the idea of, kind of trying to decide who you are and obviously push beyond the influences you have. It is something that I find interesting with people. I think often you find creators or artists or musicians that get stuck kind of in their influences, but it's interesting when people are consciously trying to work beyond that. So
yeah, I think the alternative is to stagnate or to just, I don't know. I would never understand the amount of work, just the amount of effort it is to do creative work. I would never understand not trying to do that and do it as you as possible. Maybe I'm just sort of narcissistic and solipsistic, but the idea of sort of resting on laurels seems really, really pointless. You're putting in so much work already.
Of course, yeah.
Especially if you're trying to do this as a career, it's hard. So the idea of doing that and then just doing that in order to essentially do sort of fan fiction or to sort of mimic someone that you idolize seems really, really bizarre to me.
Yeah, I can understand that. It's it is interesting to me, and I look forward to seeing how you develop forward into more of a Dan Waters. Maybe we'll see some Dan imitators in the future. Who knows?
God help us.
So we've touched on that you've worked with different publishers, Image and DC. A couple of years ago, you did a book called Deep Roots over at Vault,
yes,
which was a collaboration kind of between the White Noise guys and Vault, because all four of you ended up having titles with Vault at more or less the same time. Could you tell us more about the about White Noise and how it came about working with Vault?
White Noise. So White Noise is it's me, it's Ram V, Alex Packnadell, and Ryan O'Sullivan, and we're all writers. We're all UK based.
Yep.
We were initially all London based, but people have sort of spread out because life is taking people outside the city. Life and property prices.
Of course.
So we met at, I think it was 2015. Yes. No, I'm trying to remember based on what book I had out. It was the first issue of Limbo.
Okay, so 2015 then.
November 2015.
Yeah.
It's when I met Ram. Ryan and I have known each other forever. I met Ram there, and we sort of started chatting after that and realized that we had similar interests and similar ambitions, and a similar idea of where comics should be going and what it should be doing. So the four of us started talking more often. We started swapping notes. We started giving each other feedback on our work, and we sort of realized it was working quite well for us. So we turned it into something a little bit more formalized, which is the studio.
Okay.
And as soon as we did that, we sort of sat down, which took a few years. As soon as we sat down, we sort of said, well, okay, what's everyone got coming up? So we can talk about it. And we realized that all four of us had individually pitched and had accepted books at Vault, who were very new at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I liked the stuff they'd been doing. I talked to a writer called Chris Lewis, he's a really good writer, did a book there called Karma Police, and he put me in touch. And it was a really nice thing to sort of happen, because it made us also realize that Vault were a place who had looked at all of our stuff individually and said that's the kind of stuff we want to be involved with. So it made us sort of feel that we had similar ambitions to them as a publisher, and we sort of went to them and said, hey, just so you know, we're all part of one thing, and they were like, great, we can work with this. And so we each had a book come out with Vault. I had Deep Roots, Alex had Friendo, Ryan O'Sullivan had Fearscape, and Ram had These Savage Shores. And they all did really quite well for us. And yeah, that's how that happened.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because all 4 books I really enjoyed, and I found that I've enjoyed a lot of the Vault titles the last couple of years. I think they've been a really solid publisher. I feel like everything has been very unique.
I think some of the stuff that Vault have really led with and really pushed has been some really risky stuff. And it's really paid off.
I think one of my favourite titles of the last few months has been Money Shot, which feels like a book that...
Yeah, there you go.
I don't know who would have put it out. It seems like such a wild card choice. But it's been really good.
I think it really captured the imagination in a way that something like sort of Sex Criminals has. And
yeah, that's true. It's just a more advanced, more sci-fi, building on Sex Criminals in a way. Who knows what's next? But I agree. I think Vault has had a really good, strong back catalogue so far. And I do think Deep Roots is one of those titles that is immediately quite in the first issue. I think I mentioned to you before that I read it when I was working in a comic book shop. I read it straight away, and then I reread it before this interview, and both times the kind of twist with the protagonist has surprised me both times.
Yeah, something we could only get away with once, unfortunately. Otherwise, it's been really annoying.
Yeah, I feel like it's a good kind of one-off, but if you do it every issue, eventually it's going to drive.
Well, you wouldn't have so much a story as just a catalogue of murders.
Just keep hitting the same thing every time and see when people finally give up on it.
Yeah.
That'd be a real test for the reader. Maybe that's a later career move of how many times can I do the same thing.
Sort of Tristram Shandy, but with more bloodshed.
So I think Deep Roots was an interesting read, as were all 4 of the White Noise books, actually. I do look forward to seeing what will come from all 4 of you guys and from your collaboration with Vault in the future. I hope you've all got different things coming up.
Yeah, I think I'm okay to say that yeah, we're still working with Vault. We're still there's still plans there.
Okay, that's good to know. I think that it was a good first 4 books, and I'm curious to see what direction you're all going to go from.
I think very different directions, which is exciting as well.
Yeah, I think
everyone's kind of pushing out in new ways,
which is interesting. I think those first 4 were quite diverse titles.
Yeah, because again, there was no planning ahead of time to do a sort of line. I mean, Deep Roots in particular was something that should have been quite a hard pitch. In that it was sort of like, we're going to do this book, and it's kind of 4 genres slammed into one, and it also bears similarities to a really, really terrible Mark Wahlberg movie. My favorite reviews of the book have been the ones that have said it's like The Happening but good.
I mean, I've got a soft spot for The Happening because of kind of how dreadful it is, you know?
Yeah, I mean, Mark Wahlberg backing away from plants while talking to them really softly. There is a certain joy in that.
It's just got a charm to it, you know? Yeah. I don't know what it is, but it's there. I every time someone mentions it, I have in the back of the mind the fact that I went to the cinema to see that, and I'll always know that that's something I paid for.
I mean, I'll do you one better. I own the DVD. It was bought for me. I can't remember why. Someone got it for me as a gift. I don't know if it was a gag gift or not.
Are you still friends with that person? Or?
I think it might be my mum.
So definitely not friends then.
Yeah, no.
I don't know if I respect you more for owning it or not. I'm not.
I mean, I don't know where it is. That's another question. Might still be at my mum's.
It's the kind of thing that'll come back to haunt you, I'm sure.
Yeah. I'll leave it to someone in my will.
It's a real long-term punishment. At some point, maybe we should do another podcast where we just talk about The Happening for quite a long time. We might be the only people who would want that, but...
Well, maybe we could diversify it to Mark Wahlberg's entire discography. Filmography.
That could be a really interesting, really weird podcast. Just week by week, a different Mark Wahlberg film. I'm going to put that on the back burner as a second idea. I've completely lost my train of thought here because I'm so deep into Wahlberg now. That was a poor choice of words. To kind of round us off from Deep Roots and Mark Wahlberg, Lucifer is, as we've mentioned on and off, another title you've been working on for the last couple of years. And I think, much like Coffin Bound is kind of an exploration of Izzy's backstory and her life and where she's come from. I think there are aspects of that in your Lucifer run, of kind of who is Lucifer and what's brought Lucifer to where he is. Would you agree with that? That there's kind of similar theme between the two?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair, but I think there's quite a big difference in that Izzy is it's about who she is. It's about identity within oneself. Like how it's almost the sort of Ship of Theseus things, like how many, or not necessarily the Ship of Theseus, but the sort of, that sort of like that sort of philosophy question in that, how many pieces of grass could you remove from a field and still call it a field?
Okay, yeah.
Is it when you've removed the 1,000th piece of grass it stops being a field, or what? Coffin Bound, I think, is a little bit like that. It's a little bit like how, what can you take away from identity and still be you? Is there a core thing there? Whereas Lucifer's more about, or to me, what I'm more interested with that is about what he means to us, and what the idea of a devil or a sort of other, this sort of terrifying other. There's a few times in the book where I refer to him as the shadow on the wall of the cave, which is this idea I had right at the beginning, which is that there's two origins to Lucifer, as far as I'm concerned. There's the biblical. Well, it's not actually very biblical, but the sort of that story which mostly spins out of Milton of the war in heaven, and he's the first one that fell, and all that sort of stuff, and became the ruler of hell. That's one origin of Lucifer. But the other one is that sort of 50,000 years ago there was a caveman who saw, who was certain he saw a figure in the shadow cast by the fire on the cave wall, and was scared shitless by this, and ran out and told all his friends, and they spread the word. And that's the other origin of Lucifer. This realization that there might be something else out there that means us harm, that's judging us, that we can never understand. And what the idea of a figure like that has meant to us, how that's made us, how it's shaped us as a culture, as cultures around the world, and how that's sort of what it might feel like if that's removed, what it might feel like if that sort of shifts, or how that's shifted through the ages. Like, all those things were really, really interesting to me. And it also, of course, like it gave me carte blanche to sort of go backwards with the story as well as forwards, which was something I was really interested in doing, like looking at him through time,
Yeah.
And where he's been in history, where he's sort of cropped up and affected how we've behaved and how we've justified how we've behaved through him, all that stuff. So less than Coffin Bound, it's not about his identity within himself, because he knows who he is.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a fun thing to do as well, is that we're following him as protagonist. So yes, you kind of start wanting to put this, making him more sympathetic, making him more empathetic, making him, sort of kinder to the people around him. But he's not. He knows who he is, and he's comfortable in who he is.
Which is something I hadn't thought about, but it is interesting to kind of make, the alleged world's antagonist the protagonist, kind of flip that. And it is true, I guess. The devil is very comfortable with who the devil is. At least in theory.
I mean, he's maybe not super happy with how things went down, but he knows who and what he is, and he always has, to the point where he would try and spit in the face of the almighty and benevolent.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And just going to Lucifer, really, how have you found kind of working on a character that's got such a rich history, both in the DC Vertigo universe and in, obviously, kind of so many different sources? There's so much different Lucifer lore and so many stories, even things, with the TV show and appearances in stuff like, I don't know, Supernatural and Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. There's a whole wealth of Lucifer kind of constantly in the world. How have you felt that that's impacted on the story you've chosen to tell?
Yeah, I think that's probably not too surprising, and in the day and age we're in. I mean, it was quite intimidating at first when they sort of came to me and said, we're looking to do a new version of Lucifer, and you're the person we're looking at to do it. Because I loved Mike Carey's run. Mm-hmm. I liked Holly Black run and the stuff that came after, and the TV show was huge, and I didn't really want to mess with any of that stuff. It kind of all existed on its own merits. Like Mike Carey's run like wraps up so beautifully. I didn't kind of want. It was kind of like looking at that and going back and like, okay, well, how do you keep this going? All right, so they already managed it. They already brought him back in the last run, mm-hmm. But then to keep going with that, to keep going and keep sort of it felt to me like it would be kind of stringing it out. Because the last run ended with, spoilers for the run before mine, but it ended with Lucifer putting new people on the throne of the Almighty, and which meant that there was no longer any animosity between God and the devil, which just puts us in a very different position. Like, yeah, there's probably stories to tell from that, but it's to bring it back to a more fundamental place. To bring in all these other influences, that I wanted to, it made more sense to kind of just take it back to Sandman and just use that as the starting point for the whole book. So that's kind of what I did, which was very freeing, and it having all these different versions of the DC character, having the two different Lucifer runs, having the TV show, let me kind of look at those and just go, okay, well, here's the through threads. Here are the things that make Lucifer, as in this version of Lucifer, and it's him, it's the Mazikeen, it's the angels in hell, it's all of these things. I'm like, okay, so I can keep these core elements, and it should still feel like Lucifer, but everything else I can kind of, I didn't even feel the need to sort of overwrite anything. I could just kind of sidestep it, because he's also a character that doesn't give a damn about any of his supporting cast other than Mazikeen. So we could bring in our own supporting cast and then start digging into like all the other stuff you mentioned, finding all the sort of weird places that he's cropped up. In literature, in history, in
everywhere.
song, in art in particular.
Mm.
And sort of lean on that stuff and try and draw as much content from there rather than from the from the DC side.
Yeah, of course. And I do feel like as a run, your Lucifer has been very approaching from a different angle. So it's very different to kind of the Mike Carey run and the run before yours and the TV show. And yeah, I do think you have created a very different take on Lucifer in your run at the moment, which has been interesting to read. And
thank you. That was definitely an aim. Was to make it something that felt a little bit different, felt like its own run.
Yeah, I think you've definitely succeeded in that. So just to wrap us up, so what have you been reading at the moment, and what would you recommend as far as modern comics go, or books in general? Whatever you fancy, whatever you've been reading, really.
Oh man, I've been reading. What have I been reading? Maybe want to pop on Goodreads. I think so. The last issue of Ice Cream Man was phenomenal.
Yeah.
That's really, really good. Just really good, clean storytelling. Every issue of that book's a one shot. Mm-hmm. And it's, I think a lot of people are shouting about it, but I think more people could probably shout about it. I've been reading a fair bit of manga, working my way through 20th Century Boys.
Probably one of my favorite mangas. Actually,
it's wonderful. Tech on Concrete I just read as well. Outside of comics, reading a book right now called Only Americans Burn in Hell, which is absolutely amazing. Which is a fantasy novel that just it's a very recent book, but it's a fantasy novel that's keeps getting distracted by the fact that it's being written after the election of Trump and just keeps getting, so it's supposed to be about fairyland and it just keeps talking about basically how we're all screwed. It's really good. Jarek Kovach, quite similar to Vonnegut, but then he sort of goes on a whole rant within the book about how it shouldn't be compared to Vonnegut. It's something that kind of has to be experienced.
That sounds like an interesting one. A weird one as well, but weird is good.
One that Danny turned me on to. What else am I reading? Really excited for the new David Mitchell, which is supposed to come out in June, and I'm really hoping that's still coming out. He's one of my absolute favorite writers.
Okay.
David Mitchell is in the Cloud Atlas writer rather than the comedian.
I mean, they're both good, but in different ways.
They are, yeah. No, don't get me wrong. Peep Show is the real deal. But other than that, yeah. The Memory Police, Yoko Agawa, I think her name was.
Okay.
Really, really good recent Orwellian book basically about a pandemic, now that I think about it. So maybe one to either read to assuage some fears or avoid to assuage some fears, depending on how your brain works. Yeah,
maybe. Yeah. It's tough to know at this time, shall we say? It's...
Yeah, I mean, a few weeks down the line, we might have a better idea of how everything's shaking out.
Yeah, that's true. Hopefully, I'd like to think everything will be a little bit better in a few weeks.
Yeah.
On the plus side, all this staying in, at least I managed to read a lot of everything.
Oh man, I like that idea in theory, and then deadlines didn't go away. Which I'm very much not complaining about, frankly. A lot of people are struggling for work and things.
Yeah, it's good to be busy.
Yeah.
So, unless you've got any other books to add,
I'll remember 1,000 as soon as we.
So, on that note, I think that is everything I had to ask you about, and it has been great talking to you. Hopefully, the coffee Coffin-bound trade will be available in the UK soon, and everyone can go out and grab a copy. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Great, thanks, Zach. It's been really fun.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Cheers.
Once again, I'd like to thank Dan for joining me. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do check out our weekly show, which goes out live on Fab International Radio every Saturday morning at 11. We're also repeated every Saturday night at 11 as well. And if you want to give us a follow, we are available on Twitter at Pull or Pass. On Facebook, we are Pull or Pass Radio Show. And follow Dan as well. He's at Dan PG Waters on Twitter. Thank you for listening.